The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this resource platform webinar on cannibalization risk and corporate renewable PPAs. My name is Andrew Canning. I'm from the Wind Europe Secretariat, one of the founding partners of the resource platform, which is a platform that Wind Europe, Solar Power Europe, RE100, and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development set up to help facilitate the corporate sourcing of renewable energy in Europe. You can find more information on the platform at the address at the bottom of your screen, so resource-platform.eu. And despite the title, it's not quite as scary as it sounds, cannibalization risk. I'm joined by Vanessa Miller-Fels from Microsoft and Carl Ostrich from Resurity, who are here to perhaps allay some of your fears and answer any questions that you might have on the topic. So Vanessa is going to talk us through the cannibalization risk that exists for PPAs and how it could affect them, before Carl will talk us through the risk management tools that are out there for clean energy buyers. So we will have time at the end of the show for some of your questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a gray toolbar. If you do have any questions for our two panelists, please just open the questions tab, type away, and just note who your question is directed to. And then we'll get through of as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Vanessa, who's going to talk us all who's going to tell us all about the cannibalization risk and how it affects corporate PPAs. So Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks Resource for the invitation to present this webinar. So as Andrew said, I'm Vanessa Miller-Fels and I lead renewable energy procurement at Microsoft. We can go to the next slide. So as the world increasingly races to a future based on cloud computing, a host of new and important public issues have emerged. And one of these issues involve the energy and sustainability practices of the data centers that power the cloud. And as Microsoft works to meet its sustainability targets, we've assessed the risk allocation between buyers, sellers, the broader market when procuring renewables. And one risk that we're paying increasing attention to is this cannibalization risk that you mentioned. And that sounds very graphic, and we'll try to define it during this webinar, define its impact, why corporates can be exposed to it, and how it can be mitigated. I suggested this idea of this webinar on cannibalization risk after a great webinar that Resource organized in the fall on corporate PPAs and risk allocation. And at that time in the fall, in October, Microsoft had just announced that it worked with Resurity. So Carl is at Resurity and Allianz Risk Transfer on two innovative risk mitigation tools to address volume and what's also being called shape risk. So proxy gen PPAs and volume firming agreements that Carl will be presenting in more details. And sometimes there's confusion between the two, between volume and shape risk. So that's why we thought maybe by talking about cannibalization, which seems to be a more frequent term in the European context, first, it's more striking. It definitely stays in your mind, and hopefully we can explain that better. So you can go to slide 4, please. So on the cost side, the economics of renewables look quite impressive, and we're all very familiar with the LCOE Lazar studies. The cost of both solar and wind have dropped significantly. On average, wind now generates electricity at $70 per megawatt hour, but in the US you can have PPAs or LCOE that are as low as the low 20s or sometimes even below. For solar, we've seen also a dramatic decline in cost. In Mexico, as standard last year, solar power plants that were in the teens per megawatt hour. In some countries, wind and solar power are no cost competitive with fossil fuel plants, which is what we call grid parity, even when carbon emissions are not priced. The cost, however, only one side of the competitiveness equation. And the other one is really value, and that's where cannibalization is factored in. So just comparing electricity generation costs between different plant types is misleading because it ignores the fact that the economic value of electricity from different power stations is not the same. As you all know, this is because on wholesale markets, the price of electricity fluctuates from hour to hour or even minute to minute. And some power plants will produce electricity disproportionately at times of high prices, so-called peaking plants, but others will produce constantly at low prices. And if you can go to the next slide, the value is really what does this facility, what is the price that it captures at the time it produces. What this graph shows here is that on the value side, the market value of wind and solar power decline as it gains market share. And this is what we call this price cannibalization effect. It's the depressive impact on wholesale electricity prices at times of high output from variable resources, intermittent weather-driven forms of generation, such as solar, onshore wind, or offshore wind. And there's different patterns for each of these intermittent renewables. As more renewable capacity comes online, leading to increasing clean power output, the absence of fuel costs for solar and wind power makes them more competitive in wholesale markets, and thereby squeezing out the capacity from less efficient and higher cost conventional power plants. So in some cases, particularly we've seen in the US with the subsidy scheme that are in place, but also in the UK with we've seen that renewables can continue to receive revenue even when wholesale power prices are low or negative, as subsidies are paid when the power stations are generating energy. But if we look at, the going forward with an idea that renewables won't be relying on subsidies anymore, and there'll be limited kind of government spending on contract for differences, the income from the wholesale power is set to become increasingly crucial for wind and solar projects, at the same time as the growing cannibalization effect presents a new risk for developers. And as we're talking about corporate PPA being kind of a new route to market for developers, the question of where is that risk being allocated between the buyer and the developer or the broader market becomes quite crucial to the continuing growth of renewables in a given market. You can go to the following slide. So this is an example taken from a recent study from DG Energy in Germany that shows that the German wind-powered electricity is already coming down as more power, renewable power, as more wind power kind of comes online. It's already become 10% less valuable than that from other generators. The reason for the value drop is really what I said, just simple economics. During windy hours, the excess supply of renewable-based electricity depresses the power prices. And this is precisely when renewable generate most electricity. So they will be kind of disproportionately earning low prices. That's what we call kind of this self-cannibalization effect, or renewables eat their own lunch. Basically, renewables are kind of a victim of their own success. And it can be worse, and really this depends, again, market per market, but it can be worse for solar power. In Germany, solar power has lost more than 20% of its value. The drop in value of solar is steeper for one reason, because the output is concentrated in fewer hours of the year and mostly summer middays. So there's also a seasonality to that cannibalization effect. We can go to the following slide. So what does that really mean, cannibalization, and why is this happening? And it's all related to the merit order, which is underlying wholesale power markets in both in the US and in Europe and in a number of countries. Electricity prices, so the merit order means electricity prices are determined by the marginal price for producing power, or in other words, the most expensive source of generation that's required to meet demand during a period. And because renewable generation from wind, solar, and hydro has no fuel cost and relatively low O&M costs, they have a marginal cost that we consider as close to zero. And so the overall effect of extra renewables on wholesale electricity prices is to reduce the average price due to displacing fossil fuel-based generation, but also due to those negative prices that I mentioned earlier. But nevertheless, what's interesting is that fossil fuel generation and fossil fuel prices may still play a dominant role in setting wholesale prices when residual demand is being met by these conventional generation technologies. For example, you can see here the difference between the Italian market and the effect of additional renewables, and the German market and the effect of additional renewables. Because of the overall composition of the energy mix in both markets, the impact will be quite different in terms of increase of fuel prices on an hourly level and on a conventional versus variable electricity prices, and the extent of the movement of the merit order. So in Germany, the merit order effect displaces all gas and oil-fired generation, leaving basically coal, wind, solar, biomass, and nuclear to be the dominant generation technologies in the market. The question is, what will happen to that merit order when all nuclear plants are turned out? Whereas in Italy, the case, the graph below shows that because the peak, the residual kind of demand is met predominantly by peaking generation technology, the impact of the fossil fuel price is much more pronounced relative to the merit order effect of renewable energy than in Germany. So why should corporate care? If you can go to the next slide, please. So I think Carl will go into more detail of how usually corporates procure and what are kind of the risk. But one of the standard kind of contracting ways for renewables to procure renewables is through virtual PPAs. And in a virtual PPA, it's a purely financial arrangement between a renewable electricity generator and a customer, the buyer or the off-taker. There's no physical delivery of power, so we're not relying, it's not a sleeve PPA, we're not relying on a utility or a supplier that could kind of balance and traditionally have played that role of balancing the power generated from the facility to the consumer, to the demand center. There are a number of risks that corporates are taking when signing these virtual PPAs. One is volume misalignment, and we're not going to get too much into the details of that one because it's a pretty straightforward, but shape is the one we're really tackling here. And the reason why it's particularly challenging for corporates is because it's very hard to model. As I've said, it relies on market specifics, but it's also very dynamic. Looking at historicals does not necessarily tell you what cannibalization will look like in the future, as it is highly related to the degree of penetration of renewables and what the overall stack of energy power, of power station you have in a given market. One other risk that traditionally corporates, or traditionally a buyer can be exposed to, particularly a utility buyer may be exposed to, was operational risk. And when Carl will describe proxy generation PPA, I think one of the benefit is really protecting or isolating the buyer from any operational risk of the renewable facility. She can go to the following slide. So what are the solutions that we've seen in the market to be able to address this cannibalization risk? So first, as I've just mentioned, the project can internalize volume and or shape risk. And historically, that has been the case. The buyers have assumed both the volume and shape risk arising from the intermittency of generation from renewable sources. And this is derived from the typical utility off-taker model, where a utility is really the best suited to manage and aggregate that risk as a buyer of power from multiple sellers and from different technologies. But this is really different for corporates that may be a buyer from a single renewable energy plant in a given market. Sure, corporate buyers have impressive ambitions and they may contract many PPAs, but in a given market, they may not have a portfolio, but only one or two projects. How can the buyer kind of take that risk, and what effect will it have, of course, on the economics of the deal is really where the rubber meets the road. So different ways the buyer can take that risk is first accept the volume risk by offering minimum volume guarantees over an appropriate period of time. The issue there might be what's the accounting treatment behind it. So that might differ in the US versus Europe. And I won't get into that as I'm not an accountant. Less frequently, it may accept a portion of the shape risk or of the cannibalization risk by, of the volume risk by committing to an actual shape delivery profile, such as seasonality or monthly. And even less frequently, but we've seen that in some markets, particularly the Nordics, offer a simple average PPA or a fixed cannibalization factor, so that the corporate is not exposed to that dynamic nature of cannibalization that I mentioned earlier. And the other way to try to mitigate this volume and cannibalization risk is through reinsurance products, and that's really what Carl will be talking about right after me. But another, if you can go to the next slide, and that's my last slide, another way also to think beyond just a relationship between the buyer and the seller to address that specific, meaning the cannibalization risk, is what can be done at the market level. And there's definitely lots of questions and no straight answer. But there's first a question of a need for a fundamental market redesign to implement different incentives that the sole merit order, and that's pretty much an open-ended I mean, it's a question that I don't have an answer to, but the idea is a flexible power system, if it cannot prevent the value drop, it can help mitigate it. And there's a need for more efficient matching of supply and demand in real time. So this will both require active demand side management, whereby demand is incentivized to adjust in real time to the available supply, up and down, and large-scale energy storage capable of supporting both supply and demand. So there's, of course, beyond the regulatory framework, there's, of course, the economics of the large-scale batteries that will make this cannibalization remain prevalent longer or be sorted sooner. And in addition, particularly for Europe, given the integration of the European energy market, network investments can certainly alleviate part of the cannibalization risk, and network investment will be needed to support both supply and demand matching of the whole European power grid, and also increasingly highly distributed renewable generation. So this could involve substantial increases in interconnection to make better use of the hydro storage resources in Norway, as well as exploding negative covariances in supply and demand across large distances in Europe. There's also the possibility of reinforcing local distribution networks to facilitate electricity exports or to cope with higher load peaks, for example, from further electrification of transport and heating. So these are all of these kind of reforms or changes in the market and offers in terms of product can help address cannibalization risk and protect the corporate buyer from this negative covariance that I've talked about. And I let Carl detail the two reinsurance products.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Just before we hand over to Carl, just a reminder that we will have time for questions at the end of the webinar, so do feel free to submit a question to either Vanessa or Carl. Just note in your question who the question is directed to, and we'll get through those, as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So now you've heard about the risk. Carl is now going to talk about the risk management tools that are out there for clean energy buyers. So Carl, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks also, Vanessa, for that really good presentation detailing the issue of cannibalization. If we go to the next slide, I have a couple of slides to make sure that everyone's familiar with Resurety. We've done a lot of our work so far in the US and Australia. So for the European audience, I want to make sure that everyone is aware of who we are and what we do. And then we'll spend the majority of the time looking at the different risk mitigation tools that are available to clean energy buyers, namely a VPPA, a virtual PPA using proxy generation, and also volume firming agreements. So Resurety is a US-based risk mitigation and information services company. What that means is we work with both energy buyers and energy sellers and offer them analytics and products which help to mitigate the financial risk which is associated with the variable generation of renewable energy projects. We were founded in 2012 and since then have contracted more than 5 gigawatts of products across both new build and operational wind and solar projects in the US and Australia. And for a bit of sort of European context, it's worth noting at this point that the products that I'll be talking about today, certainly the volume firming agreement, are fairly mature in both the US and Australia and are hopefully coming soon to the European market. So we have a range of products aimed at both energy sellers, so that developers and owners of renewable energy projects, but today we'll focus on one of the products aimed at energy buyers, the volume firming agreement. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, you know, C&Is, corporates, clean energy buyers who are entering into a virtual PPA might have two primary aims when entering into a long-term contract. The first being to achieve some sustainability goal, and the second is to manage and provide some protection against the current and future costs of meeting their electricity consumption. And a metric of success for the first goal might be, metric of success for that first goal might be, you know, through additionality, helping new projects be constructed, or through the indirect or direct consumption of renewable energy or the receipt of renewable energy certificates. But the metric of success and the ability for a virtual PPA to provide a clean hedge against their consumption costs is less straightforward. Okay, so on the next slide, before we get too deep into the details of the different risk factors and how they apply to virtual PPAs, it's worth spending a moment discussing proxy generation and proxy generation PPAs. So proxy generation might seem or sound like some complicated metric and some abstract idea, but actually it's very simple. Proxy generation is the expected generation for a wind or solar project based on two things. The first is the the available wind resource, and the second is the expected operational efficiency. And so a proxy generation PPA is simply a traditional virtual PPA that uses proxy generation as its settlement index, rather than the actual generation from the project. And that has two primary benefits. The first, as Vanessa mentioned, is that it protects the buyer from the operational risk and correctly allocates that risk and that variability to the project. The second benefit is that it simplifies the addition, either retrospectively or concurrently, at the time of signing the VPPA. It simplifies the addition of further risk mitigation tools, such as the volume firming agreement. Okay, so on the next slide, we'll look, again, revisiting these two primary aims. Now, when we look at a virtual PPA using proxy generation as its settlement mechanism, we have this risk allocation matrix on the right-hand side. And so when we're thinking about the efficacy of a virtual PPA as a hedge against energy cost risk, we can look at these risk factors and these variables that would affect the settlement of a virtual PPA. So we're using ProxyGen in this case, and so you see that the operational efficiency is assigned to the project. The clean energy buyer is unaffected by that. But there are still a number of risk factors and a number of variables that will affect the settlement of that virtual power purchase agreement and its effectiveness as a hedge. And the two that we'll focus on here are the resource volume and the resource shape. And again, the shape is synonymous with this cannibalization risk. And so those two effectively boil down to the quantity and the timing of the generation from the renewable energy project and how well correlated that is with the consumption and load profile of the clean energy buyer. So on the next slide, we sort of formalize that in words. You know, most clean energy buyers have a fairly predictable and stable load profile, be it a data center or a manufacturing facility. But the generation profile from a wind or solar project, on average, will rarely line up well with that load profile, and is also subject to variability, both in terms of the resource and the timing of that generation as well. And so that lack of direct correlation between those two means that in many cases that virtual PPA will be only a partial hedge against the future consumption cost of the clean energy buyer. And that's where the volume firming agreement comes in. So if we skip to the next slide, we can talk about exactly what a volume firming agreement is, and then we have an example as well of what that might look like for a particular clean energy buyer entering into a PPA with a wind project. So a volume firming agreement is simply an additional contract, an additional agreement which the clean energy buyer enters into, this time with an insurer. And it effectively translates those resource volume and resource shape risks to the insurer. And so the hourly variability of that generation and of that the value of the power is transferred to the insurer, and in return the clean energy buyer is able to lock in a fixed dollar per megawatt hour cost of serving their load. So they essentially end up with a load, a financially settled contract which matches up very well with their load profile. On the next slide, we have an example of how that would play out. So this is an example from ERCOT, which is the electricity market in Texas, but it's an example which can be easily transferred to many markets as well. So in this case, we have a clean energy buyer that has 50 megawatts of load, and that's fixed and around the clock. And again, they have these two primary aims of achieving a sustainability goal and managing their cost risk through purchasing renewable energy. So the first transaction that they enter into is a 10-year VPPA. They found a wind farm with a sufficient capacity factor to, on average, meet their consumption of 50 megawatts. But as we've discussed already, that VPPA on its own wouldn't give them a full and clean hedge against their consumption costs. So the next transaction that they enter into is a VPPA a VFA with an insurer. And again, those hourly gains and losses from the PPA settlement are passed to the insurer, and the insurer in return provides a fixed cost of serving that 50 megawatt load for the next 10 years. Importantly, the clean energy buyer is still able to achieve that sustainability goal because they retain typically the RECs and other environmental attributes that they would normally receive as part of the VPPA contract as well. Okay, on the next slide, there's just some links to press that was put out last year after Microsoft closed their VFA contracts, some links for further reading as required. And then on the next slide, again, some more additional resources, some contact information for people at Resurety, also some contact information for law firms and consultants that we've worked with in the past who are well versed in these issues and can provide additional expertise, and then also some white papers that we've helped author along the way, which could also be useful resources for people after the webinar. Okay, thank you.
Carl, thank you very much indeed for that. Now we have some time to take some of your questions. So I'll just start with this one. Are there any, I don't know, perhaps this is one for you, Carl, or Vanessa indeed, are there any barriers that you see to proxy generation PPAs in Europe? And if not, why haven't we seen any so far?
Vanessa, maybe you're more of a European expert than I am, you might be the best one to take the first stab at that one.
Sure. Happy to take it, but I don't see any barriers to proxy generation PPAs in Europe. I think it's all about getting. I don't see any, for example, accounting difficulty to proxy generation PPA because there would still not be any notional. I mean, it's still a weather-related volume. So I think it's more about bringing the methodology and educating the market on the volume firming agreements. It's another topic, and it's not necessarily barriers. I mean, I can think of something from a regulatory framework or from an accounting perspective that would prevent reinsurers and companies like Maturity or Allianz to offer volume firming agreements, but I think it's more what would be the right price and what would be the right term for these products. And we currently see products similar to volume firming agreements for 3 years term, maybe pushing it a little bit further, but certainly not to the 10-year term that Maturity is capable and Allianz are capable of proposing right now in Australia and the US. I think not all markets will be mature for volume firming agreements due to either uncertainty in policies or just competitiveness in pricing. I mean, if I think about the Nordics are maybe not, even though they are one of the most attractive market for corporates PPA, they may be not the first market for volume firming agreements because there's already tools to kind of get to the same end from a buyer or a seller's perspective.
Yeah, and I think your point there is a good one, Vanessa, around one barrier to entry is potentially the analytical rigor that's possible and the policy certainty that is present. As you mentioned during your presentation, a look back of how cannibalization risk has affected projects in the past is at best a poor predictor of that risk going forward, especially over a 10-year term. And so having at least a reasonable view of policy in certain markets and also an ability to look at that analytically could be a barrier to entry.
Thank you both. Perhaps I can just ask Carl, how does somebody's asking here, how does your product compare to a proxy revenue swap? Is it different, and if so, how?
Yeah, so they are different. Maybe for the slide kind of passed quickly at the start of the presentation, but the proxy revenue swap is a product which is, again, designed to be a risk mitigation tool and provide more financial certainty. But in the proxy revenue swaps case, it's a product designed for energy sellers, so the owners and developers of wind projects, whereas the volume firming agreement is a product which is designed and aimed at energy buyers. So, similar concept underlying them, but fundamentally aimed at different parts of the equation and different people in the transaction.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you, Carl. Perhaps just to go back to Vanessa again, do you see, the cost of insurance, do you see that having an effect on the price of PPAs? And if so, in a market with a low wholesale price, how would that have an effect?
It has an effect, though it's separate. In a sense, we're not, the volume firming agreement is settled with the reinsurer, so it's not settled with the PPA seller, but it functions as a reinsurance product. So it is a premium to fix the risk we're exposed to. So it would increase, likely. I mean, I haven't seen negative VFAs so far. It would increase the PPA price, but it just make it more attractive for corporate buyers to understand and assess the risk over the term of the PPA that they have to sign 10 to 15 years if we're going to go for merchants, pure merchant PPAs in Europe, which we haven't seen in all markets yet. In terms of, what about a PPA price in a already low wholesale price market? Well, that's the question of what's the capex kind of cost of these renewable projects, and can they compete in a low wholesale market?
And in terms of, thanks, Vanessa. In terms of the protection that volume firming agreements offer to buyers, could you explain a little bit more the type of protection that they offer?
Yeah. So the effectively for the energy buyer, when they enter into a volume firming agreement, the settlement, the variable settlement of their PPA is passed through to the insurer, and in return, there's a fixed price per megawatt hour contract in place with the insurer. And so it means that two of those big variables in the settlement of their PPA are no longer, they sort of net out and are no longer, a concern for the energy buyer.
Thanks, Carl. So in terms of, from a corporate perspective, how different would that be from signing just a normal sort of baseload PPA?
What do you mean by baseload PPA? Because this is something that can be offered in some specific markets in Europe, but it's not necessarily offered widely in other markets like the US. So just want to make sure I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not something that would be readily available in Europe. I don't know if Carl has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of questions here about sort of, how is the volume firming agreement different from some of the other, utilities can sometimes offer this facility, and effectively on many levels it's a similar product. The difference is, as Vanessa mentioned, the sort of cost effectiveness of and availability of those different options. And so insurers in this case are in often a strong position to offer this facility at a good price, because they're looking for diverse weather-related risks to add to a large portfolio that they already hold. They're well versed in risk and risk management, and so they're often, from a cost perspective, competitive with other options, and in some cases those options of having utilities or the developer or the owner of the project kind of offer that equivalent firm volume, and all that volume and shape risk is often either not available or less competitive than the insurance option.
And yeah, just to go back to your question about baseload PPAs, one of the reasons why maybe this can be attractive to some corporates, in particular to Microsoft, has to do with accounting reasons. Baseload PPAs can be problematic from an accounting standpoint, whether it would lead to derivatives or to hedge accounting. And given that we have a growing load, it's always a struggle for us to determine kind of what would be the appropriate baseload volume that we could contract, and to which we could get kind of hedge accounting. So, but yes, in terms of exposure to the buyer, it's similar. You would be protected from that spread, from that cannibalization risk.
Thanks both for that. Perhaps time for one more question. This one to Carl. In what countries could you expect your product to be ready to trade?
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the start, the VFA, the volume firming agreement, is considered a mature and available product in the US and Australia. We're certainly looking very closely at the European market. As I mentioned before, a couple of the considerations is the ability and the prevalence of corporate interest in buying renewable power, and also the policy certainty, and also the analytical certainty that comes along with a certain market. So I don't have a list of countries which would be sort of available. It's something which is on the horizon, but not in the immediate near term. But we would expect, if there's sufficient interest, to be able to expand our offerings into Europe.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl and Vanessa. I think that's probably all we have time for in terms of questions. Time is pressing on. Just to remind you that you can get a copy of this afternoon's webinar on the Resource Platform website. So that's resource-platform.eu. All that remains for me is to say thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon at, well, in a little bit further ahead in time, but in October, from the 2nd and 3rd to the 3rd edition of our annual Resource Platform event in Amsterdam. And again, you can find all of the details for that on the Resource Platform website. So thank you very much again, and goodbye.